The rain was a constant companion that season. It fell not with the righteous fury of a summer storm, but with the grim persistence of a debt collector. It turned the black soil of his meager fields into a sucking sludge, seeped through the moss-chinked timbers of his small house, and dripped a miserable, irregular rhythm into the pot he kept by the hearth. Elias listened to it now, the water striking the clay, each drop a tiny tick of a clock counting out the seconds of his quiet, empty life. He sat on a low stool, the firelight painting one side of his face in flickering orange and leaving the other in the deep gloom that owned the rest of the room. He was mending a leather strap for a yoke, his hands moving with the slow, practiced economy of a man who had performed the same tasks 1,000 times. The awl slid through the thick hide, his thumb pushing the wax thread after it. It was work that needed no thought, which was a mercy. Thought led to memory, and memory was a barren field he had long since stopped trying to plow. The farm was all he had left. A handful of acres carved out of the edge of the whisperwood, a place most men were wise enough to avoid. It was a hard life, wrested from stubborn ground under a sky that was more often gray than blue. But it was predictable. The sun rose and set. The seasons turned. The work was always there. He asked nothing more of the world, and the world, in turn, seemed to have forgotten he existed. It was a fair trade. His gaze drifted to the single window, a square of wavering, rain-slicked gloom. Beyond it lay nothing but the sodden fields, the skeletal fingers of the winter-bare woods, and the rising spine of the Dragon's Tooth Mountains. No roads led here. Not really. Just a track that dissolved into mud and memory, a path no one had a reason to walk. His solitude was a fortress built of isolation and silence. He had come here after the fever took his wife, after the blight took his first farm, after the hope had been scoured out of him like grain from a stone mortar. He had come here to be left alone, and for 5 years he had been. The quiet was a shroud he had pulled over himself, and he had grown accustomed to its weight. A sudden, violent gust of wind slammed against the house, rattling the door in its frame. The fire guttered, spitting embers onto the hearthstones. Elias didn't flinch. The wind was just the wind. The night was just the night. He pushed the needle through the leather again, his focus narrowing to the small, illuminated circle of his work. The world outside could rage all it wanted. It couldn't touch him in here. That was what he believed. Then came a sound that did not belong. It was not the wind, nor the rain, nor the groan of old wood. It was a heavy, splintering crack from outside, the sound of something large and desperate breaking through the undergrowth at the edge of his clearing. Elias froze, the awl held tight in his fist. His heart, a slow and steady drum, gave a single, painful lurch. He listened, every nerve straining against the howl of the storm. There was again a series of thuds, heavy and uneven, a fall, a low grunt of pain, swallowed almost immediately by the wind. It was close, too close. His first instinct was to douse the fire, to sink into the darkness and become another shadow in his shadow-filled house. Nothing good came walking in a storm in the dead of night to a place like this. It was a rule as old as the mountains. But he remained seated, a statue of worn wool and apprehension. The sounds were not those of a predator, not a bear or a wolf. They were labored, wounded. A heavy thud struck his door. Not a knock, but the impact of a body slumping against the wood. It was followed by a low, guttural whisper in a language he barely recognized but understood in tone. A command. Urgent. Slowly, Elias put down his mending. He rose, his joints creaking in protest. He reached for the old wood axe that leaned against the hearth, its handle worn smooth and dark by his own sweat. It wasn't a weapon, not really, but it was all he had. He moved toward the door, his stockinged feet silent on the cold flagstones. Through the peephole he drilled for just such an unlikely event, he saw them. Shapes, 3 of them, huddled against the driving rain. They were massive, far larger than any man he had ever seen, their forms made monstrous by the shifting, unreliable moonlight that broke through the clouds. Orcs. His blood went cold. Orcs never came this far south unless they were war bands or slavers. They were stories told to frighten children, tales of savagery and green-skinned brutality. But these were no stories. They were flesh and blood and misery, slumped against his home. One was clearly the leader, taller, broader, with a thick braid of black hair plastered to her skull. Even in the gloom, he could see the dark stains spreading across the leather armor on her side, the unnatural angle of her left arm. She was leaning heavily on another, who was also hurt, a crude bandage wrapped around her thigh. A third stood guard, a jagged axe held in a two-handed grip, her head swiveling, scanning the darkness of the woods behind them. He saw something else, too, far off at the edge of the tree line. Torches, a small constellation of angry, bobbing lights, moving slowly, methodically. Searching. They were being hunted. The one standing guard turned her head, her tusked profile stark against the night. Her eyes, burning with a fierce, desperate light, seemed to find the peephole, to stare directly into his own. A choice. His mind screamed at him to do nothing, to wait until they moved on or were found. This was not his fight. He had no fight left in him. He had built this quiet life specifically to avoid moments like this, to ignore the world's violence. But he saw the rain washing the blood from the leader's side in pale pink streams. He saw the exhaustion in the way the guard held her axe, a weight that was becoming too much to bear. And he saw the torches drawing closer like patient wolves. He could let them die on his doorstep. It would be the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the scent of rain and wet earth filling his lungs. He unbarred the door. It swung inward with a low groan, spilling the warm, yellow light of his fire out into the storm. The three orcs flinched back, hands flying to their weapons. The guard raised her axe, a snarl twisting her lips to reveal formidable tusks. The wounded leader, propped up by her companion, pushed herself upright, her one good hand resting on the hilt of a short, brutal-looking sword. Her eyes, the color of moss in deep shadow, fixed on him. They were filled with pain, suspicion, and a pride that was as hard and unyielding as granite. Elias held up his empty hands, leaving the wood axe leaning by the doorframe. It was a gesture of peace, but he felt no peace. He felt only a vast, terrifying foolishness. "Get inside," he said, his voice rough from disuse. Quickly, the guard growled something in her harsh tongue. The leader answered with a single, sharp word. Her gaze never left his. She was assessing him, weighing his intent with an unnerving intensity. He saw the calculation in her eyes, the desperate gamble she was being forced to take. He simply stood there, holding the door open, the wind and rain soaking the front of his tunic. He was just a man, small, unassuming, with sorrow etched into the lines on his face. He was no threat to them, and they all knew it. The only question was whether he was a trap. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, the leader gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. The guard, still radiating suspicion, moved first, her axe held ready as she scanned the cramped interior of the cottage. The other helped the leader limp over the threshold. The sheer size of them filled his small home. The ceilings seemed to drop, the walls to close in. They brought with them the smell of wet pine, cold mud, and the sharp, metallic tang of blood. He shut the door behind them, the heavy bar falling into place with a solid, final thud. The sound of the storm was instantly muted, replaced by a tense, strained silence broken only by the crackle of the fire and the leader's shallow, pained breathing. For a long moment, nobody moved. The two lesser-wounded orcs stood defensively around their leader, who had slumped against the wall, her face pale beneath its green tint. Her dark eyes were locked on him, watchful and sharp as a hawk's, even through the haze of pain. Elias felt their collective suspicion like a physical weight. He knew what he looked like to them. A human. A farmer. Weak. Potentially treacherous. He cleared his throat, the sound loud in the quiet room. "The floorboards by the window are loose," he said, his voice low. "Don't step there." The guard's eyes narrowed. She took a deliberate step toward the spot he indicated, testing the board with her heavy boot. It groaned and sagged. She grunted, a sound of grudging acknowledgement, and shifted her stance. He gestured toward the fire. "You're bleeding." The leader's gaze dropped to her side, where her hand was pressed tight against the wound. Blood seeped between her fingers. "It is nothing," she rasped, her voice a low rumble, like stones grinding together. It was very clearly not nothing. Elias moved to the hearth, ignoring the way the guard's axe shifted to follow him. He stoked the fire, adding a few more logs until it blazed brightly, casting away the deepest shadows. Then he filled a kettle from the water barrel by the door and set it on the iron hook over the flames. He moved with purpose, focusing on the familiar tasks, letting them anchor him. He gathered what he had: clean rags from a chest, a small bottle of bitter-smelling herbal wash his wife had taught him how to make, and a needle with gut thread. He placed them on the small, sturdy table in the center of the room. He turned back to them. "I can help, if you let me." The leader watched him, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched again. He could feel the internal debate raging within her. To accept help was to accept vulnerability. For a warrior, for a leader, that could be a fatal mistake. Finally, she spoke to her companions in their own tongue. The words were clipped, authoritative. The guard argued, her voice a low snarl, gesturing toward him with her axe. The leader cut her off with a single, sharp command that tolerated no dissent. With a final, baleful glare at Elias, the guard and the other orc helped their leader to the table. They eased her down onto the stool, her breath hissing between her teeth as the movement jarred her injuries. They began to unfasten the complex straps of her leather cuirass. Elias waited until the kettle was steaming. He brought it over, along with a bowl. He did not approach her directly, instead setting them on the edge of the table. He looked at the guard. "The water needs to be cooled a little. For cleaning." The guard stared at him, then at the kettle, then back at him. She seemed to understand. She poured some of the hot water into the bowl, her movements clumsy but careful. The armor came off, revealing the tunic beneath, which was soaked through with blood. The third orc, who had a gentler demeanor than the guard, carefully cut the fabric away. The wound was ugly, a deep, ragged gash along her ribs, long and weeping. It was crudely stitched in a few places, likely a field dressing done in haste, but it was dirty and already showing the first signs of festering. Elias drew a slow breath. He was a farmer, not a healer. He'd stitched up livestock, and himself, more times than he could count. This was worse, but the principle was the same. "I need to cut the old stitches to clean it properly," he said, speaking directly to the leader. Her jaw was tight, her face a mask of controlled agony. She simply nodded, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge of the table. He picked up his sharpest small knife. He met her eyes. "This will hurt." "I have known hurt," she said, her voice a low growl. He worked in silence. His hands, usually clumsy with anything delicate, were steady. He cut the crude stitches, his movements precise. The leader did not make a sound, but he saw the fine tremor that ran through her frame, the sheen of sweat on her brow. The other two orcs watched his every move, their suspicion warring with a desperate need for him to succeed. He cleaned the wound with the herbal wash, flushing out the grime and torn cloth. It must have stung fiercely, but her only reaction was a slight tightening of her lips. Then, with the firelight glinting on the needle, he began to sew. Stitch by stitch, he pulled the torn flesh together. It was gruesome work. The needle passed through her skin with a tough, leathery resistance. He focused on the task, on making the stitches small and even, just as he would when mending a ripped grain sack. He poured all his concentration into this one small, vital act, blocking out the strangeness of the situation, the hulking, armed figures standing over him, the torches that were still, presumably, combing the woods. When he was finished, he bandaged the wound tightly with clean rags. He stepped back, wiping his bloody hands on a spare cloth. "It needs to be kept clean," he said, his voice still quiet. "The fever will be the danger now." The leader looked down at his work. The bandage was stark white against her green skin. She took a slow, careful breath, testing the pull of the stitches. She looked back at him, and for the first time, the aggressive suspicion in her eyes had been tempered with something else. A flicker of grudging respect. He turned away, feeling suddenly exhausted. He had crossed a line. His quiet, empty world had been breached, and he had been the one to unbar the door. He went back to the hearth, his shoulders slumped. He ladled 3 bowls of the thin vegetable stew that had been simmering there all evening. It wasn't much, mostly potatoes, onions, and a few sad-looking carrots, but it was hot. He took out a loaf of dark, heavy bread and cut 3 thick slices. He set the bowls and the bread on the floor, a safe distance from them. He didn't want to crowd them. The 2 uninjured orcs looked at the food, then at their leader. She gave another small nod. They fell upon the meal with a hunger that was primal. They ate quickly, without speaking, their eyes still wary. Elias busied himself with banking the fire for the night. He didn't take any food for himself. His appetite was gone, replaced by a knot of anxiety in his stomach. When he turned back, the leader was watching him again. She had not touched her food. Her bowl sat on the floor beside her, steam rising from it. "You do not eat," she stated. It was not a question. "I'm not hungry," he replied. "You give us your fire and your food. You tend my wound." "Why?" Her voice was low, demanding. The question he had been dreading. Elias shrugged, a weary gesture that pulled at his own tired muscles. He looked at the rain-streaked window, at the reflection of the tense tableau in his home. "You needed help." "Men do not help orcs," she countered, her voice sharp with disbelief. "They cage us, or they kill us." "I'm not men," he said quietly. "I'm just a farmer, and you were going to die in the rain on my doorstep. I didn't want to bury 3 people in the morning." It was only a partial truth, but it was the best he could offer. She considered his words, her gaze unwavering. "What is your price, human?" "Price?" He almost laughed, but the sound died in his throat. "There's no price. Eat, rest, be gone by morning if you can. That's all." He expected more questions, more suspicion. Instead, she fell silent. She looked from his face to the bowl of stew and then back again. Finally, with her one good hand, she picked up the bowl and began to eat. She ate slowly, deliberately, as if each spoonful was a concession. When the bowls were empty, the guard, whose name he would later learn was Zora, gathered them. She hesitated, then brought them to the wash basin, rinsing them with a startlingly domestic gesture before placing them upside down to dry. The small act of normalcy was more jarring than her earlier aggression. Elias laid out his spare blankets, thin and worn as they were, on the floor near the hearth. It was the warmest part of the house. "It's all I have," he said, gesturing to the makeshift beds. The leader, Gracia, though he did not know her name yet, allowed her companions to help her lie down. Zora took the first watch, seating herself by the door, her axe across her knees, her posture rigid. The 3rd orc, quieter and younger, settled near her leader, her hand resting on Gracia's shoulder. Elias retreated to his own small cot in the corner, as far from them as he could get. He lay down without undressing, pulling his own threadbare blanket up to his chin. The house was filled with the sound of their breathing, a foreign cadence in the familiar symphony of the night. Sleep, he knew, would not come easily. He stared into the darkness, listening to the rain, and wondered what fresh hell the morning would bring. He must have drifted off, because he awoke with a start to a profound stillness. The storm had passed. The only sound was the soft breathing of the orcs and the faint, dying whisper of the fire. He felt a chill and realized his blanket was gone. He sat up confused and saw it. It was draped carefully over the wounded leader, Gracia, adding a thin layer of warmth to the fur she already had. Standing over her was the 3rd orc, the quiet one. She was looking at him, and in the dim, pre-dawn light, he saw her nod once, a gesture of silent thanks, before she returned to her spot. He lay back down, a strange warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. It was a simple, reciprocal kindness, an acknowledgement, a thread of connection spun in the dark. The sun rose pale and watery, its light filtering weakly through the window. Elias was already awake, tending the fire. The orcs were stirring. Zora was still on watch, her eyes heavy but alert. Gracia was sitting up, her face tight with pain, but clear of the fever he had feared. He put a pot of water on to boil and ground the last of his roasted barley for a bitter, smoky drink. He had no protocol for this. What did one do with 3 fugitive orc warriors in one's house? He decided to simply continue his routine. Routine was safe. Routine was sane. He went outside to the woodpile. The air was cold and sharp, smelling of wet earth and clean, washed leaves. The world looked new, scrubbed clean by the storm. He saw the trail of their arrival clearly now. Broken branches, deep tracks in the mud. He also saw that someone had already been out. A small pile of freshly split kindling lay beside the chopping block, far more than he would have split himself. He looked toward the house. The quiet orc, Lyra, was watching him from the doorway. She gave a slight inclination of her head and disappeared back inside. They were contributing, not with words, but with work. It was a language he understood better than any other. He brought in an armload of wood and set about making breakfast. More bread, and the last of his salted bacon, fried until it crisped. The smell filled the small cottage, a scent of simple, hearty sustenance. He set a plate on the table for Gracia, and 2 more on a bench for the others. This time, he cut a piece for himself. They ate in silence, but the tension from the night before had eased. It was no longer the charged quiet of a standoff, but the more comfortable silence of people who have little to say and no need to say it. After they ate, Zora picked up one of his duller axes and a whetstone she produced from her own pack. She sat by the door and began sharpening the blade with long, rhythmic strokes. The sound of steel on stone filled the room. Lyra, meanwhile, noticed the leaky spot in the roof where the pot was still collecting drips. She examined it with a critical eye, then pointed to his tool chest. He nodded, and she began sorting through his things, looking for what she needed to make a temporary patch. He found himself watching Gracia. She sat by the fire, her wounded side propped with a cushion. She was cleaning her sword, her movements slow but deliberate. It was a beautiful, brutal piece of work, its blade dark and heavy, its hilt wrapped in worn leather. Her hands, large and scarred, moved over the weapon with an intimacy that spoke of long familiarity. She was a warrior to her very core. He went back to his own work, picking up the yoke strap he'd abandoned the night before. He sat on his stool, and the 4 of them worked in a strange, shared domesticity. An orc sharpening an axe, another patching a human roof, a human mending a yoke, and their leader, wounded but resolute, tending her blade. The scene was so profoundly strange it felt almost normal. Clear's throat. Later that day, the quiet was broken. "Your stitches are good." Elias looked up. Gracia was speaking to him. Her moss-green eyes were fixed on his hands, on the needle and thread. "My wife taught me," he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. He rarely spoke of her. She was good with her hands, mending things, making things grow. Gracia was silent for a moment, her gaze thoughtful. "She is gone." It was a statement, not a question. The emptiness of the house, of his life, was a palpable thing. Of course she knew. "Yes," he said, his voice tight. "A fever. 5 years ago. And you came here." "There is nothing left for me there," he admitted, looking down at his work. "The land went sour. This place is quiet." "Quiet is a luxury," she said, her voice low. "My life has not been quiet." She ran a thumb along the flat of her blade. "I had a clan, a home. It was taken by one of our own." The words were sparse, but they carried immense weight. Betrayal, exile, a story as old as any, but new and raw for her. He could feel the cold anger simmering beneath her calm exterior. "The torches in the woods," he said. "Gorguk," she bit out the name like a curse. "He believes what is mine belongs to him. My father's command. My hand. He is persistent." There it was, a glimpse into the violent world that had crashed into his. A chieftain's daughter, a political struggle, a forced marriage. He felt a fresh wave of unease. This was far deeper and more dangerous than he had imagined. "You should not have helped us," she said, her voice softer now, almost regretful. His quarrel is not with you, but he will not care. He will tear down this house to get to me. It's just a house, he said, the words surprising him with their truth. Yesterday, it had been his whole world. Now it felt like just wood and stone, and it's too late for that, anyway. He fell silent, and she did not press him further. But something had shifted between them. They had shared a piece of their past, two small, broken stones from the ruins of their lives. It was a fragile bridge, but it was there. That night, he woke to the smell of smoke. But it was not the acrid smoke of his house burning. It was the rich, aromatic smoke of a wood he didn't recognize. He sat up. Gracia was awake, feeding small, dark chips into the embers of the fire. "What is that?" he whispered. "Ironwood," she said without turning. "For my pack. It keeps fever at bay." The bandage needed changing. He saw the old, bloodied rags lying near the hearth. She had tended to her own wound in the dead of night while he slept, and she had used her own precious supplies to ward off the infection he had worried about. A reciprocal act of care. He lay back, watching her silhouette against the glowing embers. He had saved her from her wound. Now she was saving herself, and perhaps him, from the consequences. He had expected to be their protector in his own small way. It was a humbling realization that they were just as capable of protecting themselves and him. The next morning, he found the sign. He had gone to check the snares he kept at the edge of the woods. The snares were empty, but something else was there. Carved into the bark of a large oak tree was a symbol, a jagged, stylized eye with a tusk beneath it. It was fresh, the wood beneath still pale. His stomach clenched. It was a marker, a claim. They had been found. He returned to the house, his face grim. He didn't need to say anything. Zora saw his expression, and her hand tightened on her axe. Gracia rose slowly to her feet. "They know we are here," he said, his voice flat. "A mark on a tree at the edge of the clearing." Gracia nodded, her face a mask of stone. "A scouting party. They will come to test our strength." She looked around the small cottage, her eyes taking in every detail. The single door, the one window, the weak spot in the floor. "This place is a poor fortress. But I know its weaknesses," Elias said. "And its strengths." He walked to the loose floorboards by the window. "The ground beneath is soft. The crawl space is shallow, but it leads to the root cellar. The cellar door is outside, behind the woodpile." A plan began to form, born of desperation and an intimate knowledge of his own small world. He explained it quickly, his words concise. Zora and Lyra listened, their expressions intent. Gracia watched him, a new light in her eyes. He was not just a farmer, a healer. He was a thinker, a survivor. They didn't have to wait long. Just after midday they came. 4 of them, moving out of the woods with a practiced, arrogant confidence. They were large, heavily armed orcs, clad in black iron and cruel-looking furs. One of them carried the same symbol of the tusked eye on his shield. Elias watched them from the peephole. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was it. The violence he had run from had found him. "They are spreading out," he murmured. 2 for the door, 2 for the window. "Let them come," Gracia said from behind him. She held her sword in her good hand, her stance solid despite her injury. Zora was a coiled spring by the door. Lyra had taken a position near the hearth, a heavy wood axe in her hands. The 2 orcs at the front door didn't bother knocking. One of them lowered his shoulder and slammed into the wood with the force of a battering ram. The bar groaned but held. He hit again. Wood splintered. "Now," Gracia commanded. Zora, positioned to the side of the door, swung her massive axe in a horizontal arc just as the door burst inward. The first orc stumbled through, straight into the path of the axe. The impact was sickening. He went down without a sound. The second orc roared in fury and charged in, his own weapon raised. But his first step inside landed squarely on the loose floorboards by the window. Elias had pulled the supporting joist away from below just minutes before. The boards gave way with a sharp crack, and the orc plunged halfway through the floor, his legs dangling in the crawl space, his torso trapped. He bellowed, struggling, and Lyra was on him in an instant, the heavy axe falling with brutal efficiency. 2 down. Outside, the other 2 scouts, hearing the sounds of the fight, converged on the broken door. But Elias was already moving. He scrambled down into the root cellar, through the narrow passage he knew so well, and emerged from the outer door behind the woodpile. He carried a pitchfork. It felt flimsy and absurd. The 2 remaining orcs were focused on the doorway, trying to see into the gloom. They didn't hear him. He was a farmer. He knew how to move quietly on his own land. He wasn't a warrior. He couldn't fight them head-on, but he could be a distraction. With a yell that was thin and reedy in the open air, he charged, not at them, but at the rickety, rain-rotted fence that penned his single goat. He slammed his shoulder into it. The fence collapsed. The startled goat, bleeding in alarm, bolted directly toward the 2 orcs. It was a small thing, a ridiculous thing, but it was unexpected. The orcs turned, startled, as the panicked animals scrambled past them. In that moment of distraction, Zora appeared in the ruined doorway. She threw a hand axe with vicious accuracy. It spun through the air and buried itself in the throat of one of the orcs. He gurgled, clutching at his neck, and fell. The last scout, realizing he was alone, turned to run. He never made it to the tree line. An arrow, fletched with dark feathers, sprouted from the back of his knee. He screamed and went down, clutching his leg. Lyra stood on the porch, a short, powerful Orcish bow already lowered. It was over in seconds. Silence descended, broken only by the whimpering of the wounded orc and the distant, indignant bleating of the goat. Elias stood, leaning on the pitchfork, his body trembling with adrenaline. He had done it. He had fought. He had helped. He looked at the bodies, at the blood staining the mud of his yard, and felt a wave of nausea. Gracia came out of the house, Zora at her side. She surveyed the scene, her face grim. She walked to the last, wounded orc. He spat at her, a curse on his lips. She looked at him with something that might have been pity, then ended his suffering with a swift, clean thrust of her sword. She turned to Elias. He was still standing by the broken fence, the useless-looking pitchfork in his hands. He felt small and foolish and terribly out of place. She walked over to him, her limp more pronounced now. She stopped in front of him and looked at his face, then at the pitchfork, then back at his face. "You did not run," she said. Her voice was quiet, filled with a new kind of wonder. "It's my home," he said, though the words felt hollow now. "It was a good plan," she continued. "You used the ground you knew. You used surprise. You fought with your head, not just your arm." She reached out and, with surprising gentleness, took the pitchfork from his hands and set it aside. A warrior's mind in a farmer's hands. He didn't know what to say. He had never been called a warrior. He had only ever been a man who endured. The victory was short-lived. They all knew it. This was just the opening move. Gorguk would know his scouts had failed. He would come himself, and he would not come with just 4 orcs. They dragged the bodies into the woods, a grim task that left them all silent and somber. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the clearing, a new figure emerged from the tree line. He was massive, even for an orc, clad in ornate, black and gold plate armor that dwarfed Grash's simple leathers. A long, horned helmet was tucked under one arm, revealing a face that was a roadmap of old scars and brutal arrogance. 2 guards, equally imposing, flanked him. It was Gorguk. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, his eyes sweeping over the small farm, the damaged door, the bloodstains in the mud. His lip curled in a sneer. "Gracia!" he bellowed, his voice echoing in the quiet air. "You have led me a merry chase, and you have found yourself a fitting kennel. Come out. This farce is over." Gracia stepped forward, her hand on her sword. Zora and Lyra moved to stand with her, forming a small, defiant line. Elias remained near the house, feeling utterly exposed. "This is not your concern, Gorguk," Gracia called back, her voice ringing with authority. "Leave this place." Gorguk laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Leave? I have come to collect what is mine. What your father promised me. Your hand." and the armies that come with it. You will be my war bride, and we will crush the southern clans. That is your purpose." He finally seemed to notice Elias, standing half-hidden in the shadow of the cottage. Gorguk's eyes narrowed in contempt. "And what is this? Did you trade your honor for the protection of a dirt-scrabbling human? Have you fallen so low?" The words hit Elias like a physical blow. Dirt-scrabbling human. He saw the truth of it in Gorguk's dismissive gaze. That was all he was, all he would ever be to them. He looked at Gracia, and a cold, bitter certainty settled in his heart. She had used him. Her kindness, the shared work, the quiet moments by the fire, it was all a lie, a means to an end. She was a high-born lady, a chieftain's heir, and he was just a convenient bolt hole, a temporary shield. He had been a fool to think it was anything more. The fragile connection he'd felt shattered, leaving only a raw, aching sense of betrayal. He was nothing to her, a tool to be used and discarded. "I will offer you this one chance," Gorguk continued, his voice dripping with false magnanimity. "Come with me now. Renounce this pet. I will even let him live. He can stay here, in his hovel, and dream of the woman who was too great for him." Elias felt his face flush with a hot, bitter shame. He wanted to turn and walk away, to disappear back into his house and pretend none of this had ever happened. But his feet were rooted to the spot. He watched Gracia, waiting for her answer. He expected her to negotiate, to bargain, to sacrifice him for her own survival. It was the logical thing to do, the political thing. Instead, she drew her sword. The blade rasped from its sheath, catching the last rays of the setting sun. "There is nothing of mine for you to collect, Gorguk," she said, her voice like ice. "And this man," she flicked her gaze toward Elias, and in her eyes he saw not the pity or contempt he expected, but a fierce, protective fire, "has shown more honor in 2 days than you have in a lifetime. His home is under my protection. You will not touch it. You will not touch him." Gorguk's face contorted with rage. "Protection? You are the one who needs protecting. You are wounded with only 2 warriors against my 50. Do you see my banners in the trees, Gracia? The Bloodtusk clan is here. This is the end." As he spoke, more figures emerged from the woods. Dozens of them, orcs in heavy armor, their weapons gleaming. They formed a semicircle around the farm, a ring of iron and grim intent. The farm was surrounded. There was no escape. The siege began as twilight bled into night. The first wave came with a roar, a tide of black iron and fury surging across the clearing. Fire arrows arched through the sky, thudding into the roof and walls of the small house. The dry timbers of the porch caught quickly, flames licking up the posts. Elias acted on instinct. He grabbed the buckets of water he always kept full and began dousing the flames, the smoke stinging his eyes and choking his lungs. Beside him, Lyra fired arrows into the advancing horde with deadly speed, each shot finding a gap in armor, a moment of exposure. Zora stood in the ruined doorway, a whirlwind of steel, her axe cleaving shields and helmets. But there were too many. For every one that fell, 2 more took its place. They were at the walls now, hacking at the wood, trying to smash their way in. Elias abandoned the futile effort with the water and grabbed the only weapon he had left, the old wood axe. He stood beside Zora, his knuckles white on the handle, his body thrumming with a terror so profound it felt like a strange calm. A huge orc smashed through a shuttered window, roaring in triumph. Before Elias could even react, Gracia was there. She moved with a limping, deadly grace, her sword a blur. She sidestepped the orc's wild swing and drove her blade up under his jaw. He fell back out of the window, silenced. Her wound had reopened. A dark, wet patch was spreading across her bandage. She ignored it. Her eyes met Elias's over the chaos. There was no time for words. There was only the fight. He saw it then. This wasn't about using him. This was about her making a stand. She could have surrendered. She could have bargained. But she had chosen to defend his home, his life, as if it were her own. The bitter shame he had felt curdled and transformed into something else. A fierce, desperate loyalty. He was just a farmer, but this was his land. and these were impossibly his people. He swung the axe. The blade bit into the arm of an orc trying to climb through the window. The orc howled and fell back. Elias swung again, his movements clumsy but fueled by a cold rage. He would not let them take this. He would not let them take her. The house was burning in earnest now. The roof was a crown of fire, smoke pouring into the room, making every breath a painful, rasping ordeal. Cinders rained down like angry insects. The cellar. Gracia yelled over the din, her voice hoarse. To the cellar. Lyra and Zora fell back, covering their retreat. Elias grabbed Gracia's good arm, helping her toward the trapdoor to the crawlspace. She was flagging, her face pale with blood loss and exhaustion. They tumbled into the narrow, dark space below the floor, pulling the trapdoor shut just as the main roof beam overhead gave way with a deafening crash, showering the floor above with fire and collapsing timbers. They were trapped in the dark, the roar of the fire and the battle overhead a muffled thunder. The air was thick with the smell of dust and damp earth. "We are finished," Zora growled, her voice raw with despair. "No," Gracia said, her breathing ragged. She was leaning against the earthen wall, her sword still clutched in her hand. Not yet. They could hear Gorguk outside, bellowing for them to surrender, to come out and die. In the suffocating darkness, surrounded by the sounds of his world being destroyed, Elias felt a strange clarity. He had lost everything once before and retreated into solitude. Now, he was losing it all again, but this time was different. This time, he was not alone. Gracia coughed, a deep, rattling sound. "Elias." He crawled closer to her. "I'm here." "Gorguk will not stop," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He thinks he has won. But orc law is not so simple. A chieftain's daughter can refuse a war bond. She can choose her own mate. It is an old right, rarely used. A challenge. He didn't understand. "What are you saying?" She reached out, her hand finding his in the dark. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "He called you a pet, a dirt scrabbler. He thinks you are a weakness." Her voice grew stronger, laced with iron. "I will show him you are my strength." She pulled herself up, her movements stiff with pain. "When we emerge, I will declare for you. I will bind myself to you before my clan and his. It will be an unbreakable vow. It will make his claim on me void. He will be forced to challenge you, or me, in single combat for leadership. Or he will be shamed, his authority broken." Elias's mind reeled. Bind herself to him? A human farmer? It was madness. "They'll kill you," he said. "They'll kill us both." "They are trying to kill us already," she countered. "This is the only path that is not a simple death. It is a chance." She squeezed his hand. "He sees you as nothing. I see a man who defended his home with a pitchfork. I see a man who stood his ground when warriors would have fled. I choose that. I choose you." The fire above them was dying down, the roar lessening. They would have to move soon. He looked at her, or rather, at the fierce, determined shadow that was her in the darkness. She was offering him a future. A bloody, violent, uncertain future, but a future nonetheless. A place beside her. The alternative was to die in a hole under his burned-out house. He thought of his quiet life, the endless, lonely days. He had thought it was peace, but it had only been an absence, an emptiness. Gracia and her warriors had filled that emptiness with danger and chaos, but also with purpose, with connection. "Section," he was seen. "All right," he said, his voice steady, "but not as something you protect." She tilted her head, a silhouette against the faint light filtering through a crack. "I'm a farmer," he continued, finding the words as he spoke them. "I'm a human. I will not hide that. I will not be your dependent, hidden away in your fortress. If I stand with you, I stand as I am, beside you, not behind you." For a long moment, she was silent. He felt her studying him in the dark, weighing his words. He had given her an ultimatum of his own, a condition for his life. Then he heard the softest sound. It might have been a laugh or a sigh of relief. "Then stand," she whispered. They pushed open the root cellar door into a world of smoke and embers. The house was a skeleton of charred beams, open to the night sky. Gorguk's orcs had formed a circle, their weapons ready, their faces lit by the smoldering ruins. Gorguk stood in the center, his arrogant sneer firmly in place. The rats come out of their hole. It is time to die. Grasha walked forward, limping but upright, her head held high. Elias walked with her, a step to her right, just as he had said. He had no weapon but the dirt on his hands and the resolve in his heart. He felt 100 pairs of hostile eyes on him, a crushing weight of contempt and hatred. Gorguk, Grasha's voice rang out, clear and strong, defying her wounds. You claim me by my father's word, but you forget the old laws. You forget a warrior's right to choose. She turned and took Elias's hand, raising it for all to see. His calloused, dirt-stained hand in her larger, scarred one. I renounce your claim. I renounce the bond of my father. I choose my own path. I choose my own mate. I choose Elias of this land. A wave of shock and disbelief rippled through the assembled orcs. Murmurs turned into angry growls. Gorguk's face went from arrogance to disbelief, then to pure, murderous fury. You choose. Him? He spat, as if the word was poison in his mouth. This thing? This is your great defiance? To shame your bloodline with a human peasant. His blood is truer than yours, Grasha declared, her voice cutting across the clearing like iron breaking. He stood against your 50. Where is your honor, Gorguk? You sent an army to hunt down one wounded woman and burn the home of a farmer. You are a coward, not a chieftain. The accusation hung in the air. Gorguk's eyes darted around, seeing the wavering certainty in the faces of his own warriors. Grasha had turned his show of force into a mark of shame. I will kill him, Gorguk roared, drawing his own massive sword. I will strip the flesh from his bones and prove your choice of fools. Then you must challenge me, Grasha said, stepping in front of Elias. For he is mine now. An attack on him is an attack on me. And by the law, an attack on me is a challenge for leadership of the Bloodtusk clan. Gorguk froze. He had wanted a slaughter, not a formal duel. A duel he might lose. Grasha, even wounded, was a renowned fighter. And if he challenged and killed a human, it would prove nothing but his own cruelty. Grasha had trapped him. He looked from Grasha's defiant face to Elias's calm one. He saw the human was not afraid. Resigned, perhaps, but not afraid. And that, more than anything, seemed to unnerve him. With a final, frustrated roar, Gorguk pointed his sword at them. This is not over. You have chosen your path, Grasha. You and your pet. You will find no allies. You will be outcasts. Hunted. He turned and stalked away, his guards following. His warriors, after a moment of hesitation, began to withdraw, melting back into the darkness of the woods. They left behind a ruined farm and a new, impossible reality. They left. They simply left. The clearing was silent save for the crackling of the dying fire. Zora and Lyra emerged from the shadows, their faces a mixture of awe and exhaustion. Elias looked down at his hand, still held in Grasha's. It felt real, solid. He looked at the smoking ruin of his home, the only world he had known for 5 years. He felt a pang of loss, but it was distant, like a memory of a memory. It was just a house. What now? He asked, his voice quiet. Grasha finally let go of his hand, swaying on her feet. Zora rushed to support her. Now, Grasha said, her voice strained, we go north, to the Frostback Mountains. There are clans there who still value honor over ambition. We will find allies. We will take back my home. She looked at him, her green eyes searching his. The offer stands. A place beside me. Elias looked at the ashes of his past, and then at the 3 orc women who were all that was left of his future. He had asked the world to leave him alone, and it had. Now, it was asking him to join it. He gave a slow nod. I need to get my tools. The journey north was hard. They traveled by night and hid by day. Elias, who had never been more than 10 miles from his own land, learned the harsh geography of the wild. He learned to read tracks, to forage for food that wouldn't kill him, and to sleep with one ear open. He was not a warrior. He was a liability in a fight. But he found his own ways to be essential. When Lyra's bowstring snapped, He crafted a new one from gut and sinew that was stronger than the last. When their food supplies ran low, he found a patch of wild leeks and tough mountain potatoes the orcs had never known were edible. He repaired their boots, sharpened their blades, and, most importantly, he was a steady, quiet presence in the face of their grim uncertainty. He did not complain. He did not falter. He simply endured, and he worked. The prejudice he faced was a constant, grinding pressure. When they finally reached the allied clans of the Frostbacks, he was met with open hostility and contempt. He was Grash's human, a curiosity at best, an insult at worst. Orcs would spit on the ground as he passed. They mocked his lack of strength, his small stature, his smooth skin. He ignored them. He did what he knew. He found a fallow plot of land near the fortress, land the orcs had deemed useless and rocky. He spent weeks clearing the stones by hand, his back screaming in protest. He built up the soil with mulch and night soil. He used his farmer's knowledge, the deep, instinctual wisdom of the earth, to nurture it. Grasha, meanwhile, fought her own battles. She politicked, she dueled, she negotiated. She slowly, painstakingly, rebuilt her alliances, her strength growing day by day. She never hid her connection to Elias. He was a constant presence at her side in the great halls, a quiet, unassuming human in a world of giants. His presence was a statement she made every single day. One evening, she found him in his small, burgeoning garden. He was on his knees, pressing seeds into the dark, rich soil he had created. "The elders mock you," she said, her voice soft. "They say you play in the dirt like a child." "It's not playing," he said without looking up, his fingers working deftly. "It's a promise. In 2 months, this will feed 50 families. That is more than their mockery will feed." She watched him for a long time, her expression unreadable. "Gorguk has joined the southern clans. He is marching on my father's fortress. The council has agreed to lend me their warriors. We leave at dawn." Elias stopped his work and slowly rose to his feet, wiping his earthy hands on his trousers. "All right, you will stay here," she said. It was a command. "It will be a great battle. You will be safe here. Your work is here." He met her gaze, his own quiet and unyielding. "I told you. Beside you. Not behind you. You cannot fight in a shield wall, Elias." "No," he agreed. "But I can mend the shields when they break. I can fletch the arrows that you fire. I can tend the wounded when they fall. My place is with the army. My place is with you." She saw the unshakable integrity in his eyes, the quiet strength that had first drawn her to him. It was a strength not of muscle, but of character, as unyielding as the mountains themselves. She finally nodded, a slow smile touching her lips. "Then stand." The final battle was a maelstrom of snow and steel. Elias worked in the rear, in the frantic, bloody chaos of the field hospital. He did not swing an axe, but his hands were just as vital. He stitched wounds, he set bones, he distributed water and rations. He was a small island of calm competence in a sea of panic and pain. He saw Grasha fight. She was a force of nature, her sword a blur of motion, her presence on the battlefield inspiring her warriors to impossible feats of courage. At the height of the battle, she met Gorguk in a duel that shook the earth. It was a brutal, desperate affair, but in the end, her conviction was stronger than his ambition. Gorguk fell. The battle was won. Days later, they stood in the great hall of her reclaimed fortress. Grasha was now the undisputed chieftain of the Blood-Tusk clan, her authority absolute. She wore the black and gold armor of her new station. Elias stood before her. He was helping her fasten the last buckle of her vambrace. It was a familiar gesture, echoing that first, tense night in his cottage. But now, there was no suspicion. There was no fear. There was only a deep, quiet intimacy. He finished the buckle, and his hand rested on her arm for a moment. He was still just a farmer, his hands calloused and stained with the memory of the earth. But he was no longer a man defined by what he had lost. He was defined by what he had chosen. She looked down at him, her moss-green eyes soft. The entire clan was watching them, but in that moment, they were the only 2 people in the world. They still do not understand, she said, her voice a low murmur meant only for him. They see a human. They do not see the man who built a garden on a mountain of stone. They don't have to understand, he replied, his voice equally quiet. I don't need their understanding. I only need yours. He had thought his life was about enduring what the world took from him. He had learned, through blood and fire and a love as improbable as a flower blooming in winter, that a life could also be about what you chose to build. He, a man who only knew how to tend the earth, had found a different kind of ground to cultivate. A future. Beside her,